In the early hours of August 3rd, Rocket Lab saw the launch of the 51st Electron. This mission marks Rocket Lab's first launch for Q3, 9th launch for the year, and 5th launch overall with Synspective. Rocket Lab has been providing launch services for Synspective since 2020, with another 11 launches signed after this most recent, all the way through to 2027. So while there was no launches in July, Rocket Lab's launch cadence is a little slower than usual, though the overall trend is in a positive direction. Let's go over what to expect next week for Rocket Lab's Q2 results. So to kick things off, we'll start with the guidance from Q1 earnings. The launch services was guided to be between 28 to 29 million based off of the 4 launches that we saw within the quarter, that being the HASTE NASA rideshare mission, the 2 pre-fire missions, and the 50th Electron launch, which saw the first of 5 Kinéis satellites being delivered to orbit. So when Rocket Lab guides for the launch services revenue, this is extremely spot on. And the reason for that is because I think it's like 90% of their revenue is already basically on their balance sheet by the time the launch arrives. And as soon as the Electron leaves the pad, the entirety of that revenue is recognized. So seeing that the 4 launches that were guided for landed within the quarter, we know that the revenue is pretty much exactly where it's spoken to be for, between the 28 and 29 million. So we're going to cut it in the middle, 28.5 million for launch revenue. There was a press release from Rocket Lab on July 16th that clearly mentions that there are 1,100 satellites in orbit to date. Now, these numbers I personally checked on the last day of the quarter, on June 30th. And as of June 30th, it was mentioned on their website that there was 1,000 satellites in orbit powered by Rocket Lab solar products. And since then, it has been updated. So this is likely, in my opinion, to coincide with the Q2 updates. All being said, it looks like a 10% increase from what was originally on their website to what has been updated in the first half of July. Not only has that been updated, but the same thing applied where I checked on June 30th, and the website stated that there was 415 satellites scheduled to be launched in the next few years with Rocket Lab hardware. And I checked back once I saw this 1,100 satellites in orbit, and I noticed that this number has also changed as well, to 500 plus satellites scheduled to launch in the next few years. So this increase is likely to be related to the new solar supply agreement that increased Q1 backlog by $30 million, with a potential additional 120 million at a later date. One thing that wasn't updated on this website was the 4 megawatts for the space solar solutions. This 4 megawatt number has been on their website since Q2 of 2022. I don't know what to think of that, to be honest, but it's a long time to have not had a number updated. So I'm not sure if the original number was like 4 megawatts planned or, I mean, I don't know. Time will tell. It seems like big things are happening for solar solutions within Rocket Lab, but for whatever reason, it seems like we're just stuck at 4 megawatts. Either way, we're going to circle back to Space Systems guidance. For Q2, Space Systems revenue is expected to be between $77 to $81 million. Coming back to the valuation model, you can see that some of the text here is green, some is orange, some is red, and some is blue. Now, these are all pretty much exactly what you would expect. The greens are optimistic, so whether that means a beat or just a positive increase in the numbers. Red is, think of it like a red flag. And then the blue, that is going to be our guidance. You'll notice that is only in the Q2 column. So when we're looking at Space Systems revenue, you can see that across the board, there is, green, orange, and then black. So we haven't had any red here, is really what I'm trying to get at. And you can't see it on the screen at the moment, but if we were to scroll left, there is also no red there. So Rocket Lab, when they guide for Space Systems revenue, they tend to land well within range, or if not, a slight bit above. Now you will notice the Q1 2024 cell, this is orange. The reason for that is because they guided in Q3 and then guided again in Q4. These numbers are both for Q1 guidance, keep in mind. But the second time that they guided for what would be Q1, they actually decreased the guidance. So that's why the orange is there. Not a big deal, not a red flag, but it is just something of notice. Based on guidance from Q1, Space Systems revenue growth will reflect 32% quarter over quarter and 99.75% year over year. Past the revenue, we also know roughly what to expect for the gross margins. Gross margins are guided to be between 24 to 26%, driven by favorable mix between launch and space systems and offset by less favorable mix within space systems. So what this means is that the margins for space systems is going to be worse than the margins for launch. So we know that the launch margins are going to be roughly around 26%, and with that we can assume that the space systems margins are going to be roughly 24%, landing us right around a total gross margin range of, we'll call it, 25%. Past this, we have the operating expenses. Similar situation, we roughly know what to expect here, right around the middle mark of 75 million. We're going to fast forward ahead a little bit to net income of roughly negative $50 million and a negative diluted EPS of 10 cents. For the adjusted EBITDA, Rocket Lab is guiding for 23 to 25 million. In the valuation model, we're looking at negative 28, but that is because the model is built to be conservative. Putting this all together gives us a pretty good idea of what to expect from Rocket Lab's Q2. Looking ahead is a little less visible, but of course that's not going to deter us. The Space Systems guide for Q3 is what's worth watching in my opinion. With a components run rate of roughly 38 million and a low-end MDA recognition of 26 million, these two items alone already bring Space Systems to a baseline of $65 million. Now, as for Q3 launch, things are off to a bit of a rough start. Rocket Lab was originally guiding for a potential fifth launch in Q2. Now, as for this fifth potential launch, after being assigned a 14-day launch window in the second half of July, the launch was moved to a later date so that the partner can complete additional testing. So, as a result, Synspective is next up, and seemingly lost in the shuffle was what was supposed to be a July launch for Black Sky, which is assumed to have now been pushed into August. This launch will be Black Sky's 7th launch overall with Rocket Lab, and this also marks the debut of Black Sky's Gen 3 satellite. Past this, we have Kinesis' second launch in September, and for the time being, these 3 launches are the only known launches for Q3. There are, however, a number of potential missions that are still expected in 2024, though no month has been attached to these potentials. We're going to go the glass half full route, and we're going to assume that one of these 2024 launches ends up being squeezed into Q3. Revenue per Electron launch is 7.5 to 8 million, so we can add this 31 million to the baseline Space Systems revenue of 65 million, arriving us to a mid-range baseline Q3 revenue of $95.7 million. This represents 42% year over year and negative 11% quarter over quarter. Now, keep in mind, this is baseline, right? Realistically, we can expect a number a fair bit higher. This is the absolute lowest that we see, is this 90, we'll call it 96 million. More realistically, we're probably going to hit another quarter north of 100 million, but like I said, Space Systems revenue is what is worth watching. So finally, let's get into some wishful thinking. We'll break this up similar to the way that Rocket Lab reports, where we'll go by launch services, then space systems, and then we'll kind of go the everything else category at the end. So to start off with launch, we'll start with the Electron. I'm curious to know the number of launches that we're going to see in Q3. We kind of went over it here. I think 3 to 4 is a safe bet. 5 might be a little bit too optimistic, but I'd love to be proven wrong. On top of that, I guarantee you one of the questions that's going to be asked by the analysts is like, what are we looking at for the year? The most recent commentary that we've had on the Electron launches in 2024, it was kind of like a run-on thought where it was like 17, 18, 19, 20. That's like what was like literally said, right? So I'm kind of like, what does that mean? Like 18, 19 is probably the safe bet. It was originally 22 for the year, but I mean, if it's 18, that's still fine in my opinion. That's still going to be an 80% increase in launch count year over year. And not only is it like 80% increase for the number of launches, but keep in mind, these are higher revenue launches. So you're going to see 85, 90, 95, maybe even higher percentage plus compared to 2023 comparison. So, I mean, anything higher is great. But I'd be happy with 18. I mean, I'd be happy with, honestly, 15, really. Like a 50% year over year for a company is fantastic growth, don't get me wrong. But, I mean, 18 would be ideal, right? As for new contracts, I'm wondering if we're going to hear anything. It seems kind of like lately Rocket Lab is just announcing these as they come out. You'll remember, I mean, this was like before Q2 earnings were released. We had the announcement of the USSF, that $15 million task order, and the $32 million Victus Haze mission. I mean, I'm not sure when the papers were signed, but I'm pretty sure these would fall. Actually, I'm quite sure these will fall within the Q2 period, technically. And then on top of that, we had that batch of 10 missions from Synspective. So, I mean, we already have 12 Electron missions announced in Q2. So, I mean, if they have more contracts to announce for Electron, okay, let's have them. But like, I mean, they're doing just fine as far as signing new contracts. So, on top of that, there's still some like haziness, I guess, around HASTE. We recently saw that picture of the production line where there was those two clearly labeled HASTE launches, but then that kind of contradicts what was said earlier this year from Brian Rogers about 3 to 4 this year. Now, I mean, from what we know, there are only two that were announced for this year, one being Leidos and the other being the confidential mission. So we don't even know who that is. But as far as number 3 and maybe number 4 are, that's still to be announced, or maybe an additional Leidos mission got like, they're like, hey, we're going to be ready a little bit earlier. Can you squeeze us in? Rocket Lab said, yeah. But also to contradict myself again, apparently there's no Wallops launches until the fall. So I don't know if Virginia's just going to be very busy in Q4, but I'm curious what's going on with HASTE. HASTE is going to do really well next year, but as far as this year, the whole, I mean, since the HASTE program started, really, like what was it, like middle of 2022? We've still, or 2023. Since the middle of 2023, we've seen one HASTE launch, and that's it so far. So hopefully we get some clarity around that. And then finally for the Electron, I sound like a broken record, I know, but I'm curious what's going on with the recovery. It seems like there's kind of a bit of back and forth as far as when January's booster is going to be launched. It seems like everything has gone well, and then it's like, you know, hey, we've never seen a booster that came back looking so good. And then it was like, oh, but we're also only doing one more recovery this year, which was originally supposed to be 9, I think there was. And then that booster recovery relaunch got pushed into 2025. But then I think it was on the last call, Peter mentioned that it might still happen this year. But then we also have the news that, the announcement, however you want to phrase that, that prior to the full booster reuse, we're supposed to see 9 previously flown Rutherford engines on an Electron. So I don't know if we're getting the 9 Rutherfords and then the booster later, or I mean, the whole recovery aspect of Rocket Lab right now is a bit of a big question mark. So hopefully we hear, like, I mean, literally anything on that for recovery. That being said, I mean, we can move into the Neutron. I mean, it goes without saying, everyone is holding their breath for the Archimedes hot fire. The most recent update that we have on this is, that the first hot fire test is a couple of weeks away. This was mentioned on the first week of July. So that takes us to like July end-ish. So like, I mean, by the time you see this, it's already outdated. So I'm under the impression, and I was also under the impression 3 months ago, keep in mind, but I'm under the impression that this time for real, that Rocket Lab is just like, hey, we've done the hot fire, we're just going to chill, and we're going to blow people's minds on earnings. Kind of like what we saw with the Space Systems family reveal, where market closes on the day that earnings is going to happen, and oh wait, Rocket Lab uploaded something, and oh, okay, we got big news. It's like a whole presentation or spectacle, if you will. I think we're going to get something like that for the hot fire. I mean, right? I don't know. Aside from that, I'm curious to know about Neutron spend in terms of R&D and CapEx for the first launch. I guess the question is, originally Neutron's spend was supposed to kind of ramp up in 2024 and then kind of come back down at the end of the year. And seeing that, and that was to coincide with the the first launch, the first test launch. So I'm kind of wondering, with the Neutron being pushed out an additional 6 months, does that mean that that spend is going to elongate another 6 months? And is that going to be at a higher rate than what otherwise would have been? Or is it still going to be the same amount, just kind of like elongated? I'm kind of leaning towards the latter, but it would be nice to get some clarity on that. And then I guess similarly, after that first Neutron is launched, what kind of rate can we expect from R&D and CapEx going forward? Because we know that the Neutron spend wallet, this is just to get that first test off. So that whole first Neutron, that's just going to be flowing through R&D and CapEx. And from the point of that first launch, we don't need to keep buying more machinery or more factories, right? That's going to be kind of I want to say a set cost, but of course there's still the overhead. But to bring everything in, I want to know what kind of R&D and CapEx spend we can expect looking forward. That's really it. Now for space systems, there was like a whole bunch of information regarding the Solero stuff, right? So a quick crash course for Solero. Solero was acquired in January of 2022 for $80 million in cash. Now, this number is important, so keep that in the back of your mind for the time being. Over the next couple of years, they went from what appears to be 425 staff down to 380, and they also went from 155,000 square feet of production facilities up to 174,000 square feet of production facilities. So they increased their facilities, downsized their staff, and since then, more recently, it was announced that Rocket Lab is planning to receive up to $23.9 million from the CHIPS Act, then receive another $25.5 million from the state of New Mexico. So a total so far of $49.4 million. And keep in mind, that's from a $80 million acquisition. So they're receiving another $50 million just of handouts, for lack of a better term. Not only that, but Rocket Lab plans to claim up to 25% on qualified capital expenditures. The result of these upgrades is expected to be a 50% increase in semiconductor production in 3 years with an additional 100 manufacturing jobs. So again, the most recent number we have for the staff, I've heard 350 and I've heard 370 and I've heard 380, all kind of within the same range. So, I mean, we'll call it a roughly 25% increase in headcount with a 50% increase in output. And most of it's paid for. I mean, yeah, Rocket Lab has that agreement from last quarter, but it seems like there's a lot more going on here. And I don't want to put on my tinfoil hat quite yet because, I mean, you guys are, if you're not new to the channel, you'll know that this might be my next white whale. I mean, the previous one being the reaction wheels. So I don't want to say too much quite yet, but man, I miss the days when Rocket Lab would just be like, hey, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. Because now we're kind of left having to like pick up the breadcrumbs and make a bunch of assumptions. I mean, it's fun, right? I don't know, maybe not for some of you, but I love it. Speaking of the reaction wheels, I think it was Q1 results where I think it was Adam Spice. He mentioned that the latter half of the year is going to be a little bit more reaction wheel heavy. So what that means exactly, I don't know. That's another thing that I've been following probably way too intensely. But they're expecting to produce north of 2,000 reaction wheels this year was the quote. And each of those reaction wheels goes for $100,000 to $120,000 a piece. Now, there's probably a discount for bulk orders, but even still, I'm like, we still don't really know who they're for. We kind of know who they're for, but not officially. And I mean, maybe it's time to announce that. It'd be cool to know. So hopefully we get some news on that as well. Now, we're kind of in the home stretch here. I guess aside from that is like constellations / acquisitions. I've kind of put that into one category because I feel like as soon as there's an acquisition announced, we're going to kind of be on the probably be on the right track of like, okay, this is what they're going for. Like if it's something super obvious, like they're buying the imagery equipment for Earth observation, it's going to be like, well, like what, what else could they be doing with that acquisition, right? So it's going to be pretty apparent what they're going to be doing. Now, whether they trickle out some new information or kind of tease out what it could be or what it couldn't be. So I mean, there have been so many things where it's like, yeah, we won't compete with SpaceX or Starlink, I guess rather. We won't compete with Starlink. There have been some quotes about space solar being beamed down to Earth. I'm not sure the proper term for that. We've had indirect quotes on Earth observation kind of being not a thing. At this point, I'm kind of in the camp of like maybe like constellation cleanup is an option. There's an avenue. There was a recent interview with Brad Clevenger, who's the VP of Space Systems, and he was talking about the number of trackable garbage or debris that is in orbit. And that kind of has me wondering, like, if that was just kind of like an offhand comment of like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there that we need to look out for, or if that could be a potential avenue of what Rocket Lab becomes, right? Orbital debris cleanup is something that's going to need to be done, like one way or another, right? There's going to be more and more and more satellites, and it's one of those things where it's a proactive decision that's made rather than a reactive decision, right? Because it's always, I worry that it's going to take Starlink getting knocked out, or what, like, I mean, literally name it, like GPS getting knocked out, and then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, I guess we should have been cleaning up our garbage, but now we'll start doing it now that there's like a even bigger problem, right? So it needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed sooner than later, and hopefully it is. I'm probably going on way too long about litter, but the last couple things that we'll touch on is the guidance for profitability. This, I guess, kind of ties in with the Neutron spend, but like once that Neutron, once the initial, like once Neutron is regular, that R&D is ideally going to drop off. That CapEx is ideally going to drop off, and next on the docket is like, the Constellation, and I mean, the spacecraft are developed as far as I know. Right? We have the whole spacecraft family, and the CapEx is there. We have the facilities, we got the machinery. We might need some upgrades and whatnot, but I mean, in the case of Solero, I mean, there's no shortage of people who are wanting to partner up with Rocket Lab, it seems. So I'm curious to see what management says, if anything, about profitability, because we've had some kind of passing statements in terms of profitability, and it was like, I think the comment was something like, once Neutron is launching in 2025, that's when we'll see an inflection in free cash flow. And some people were taking that as like, oh, he's saying cash flow positive in 2025. But I think what is really meant is like, we're on that downward trajectory, and then it's going to start to not be so downward in 2025. So, I mean, we're not looking at proper profitability for, I mean, a couple of years at this point, in my opinion. And I guess the last thing that we're looking for that kind of ties into what we're talking about is a stock-based compensation. That is another drag on profitability, and I'm curious to know what the plan is going forward. If that is going to be kind of at the same levels now, just kind of indefinitely into the future, or if that is something that is going to kind of phase out over the next year or whatever it's going to be. So that's what I'm expecting from Q2. If I've missed anything, let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know, hot fire or no hot fire, because like I'm convinced, and I know I said it last quarter that we might get the hot fire video out after market close, but like this time it's right. This time it's for real. It's got to be. Like, here's what's gonna happen: market's gonna close, hot fire video uploaded, earnings come out, Q3 guide is insane, and everyone's gonna get along. Right? I'm not asking for too much. Leave a like if you haven't already. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I mean, normally I pitch the Patreon here, but honestly, wait until the next updates. Like, I keep saying, the next update's big. It's big. So hang tight, and yeah, good luck for earnings. I'll see you guys on the other side. Peace.